There is a man who revolutionized the history of anime. Hideaki Anno. In Shin Evangelion, he employed unprecedented techniques. That technique is called previse. From the moment the script was finalized, miniature sets were constructed, and compositions were meticulously planned using a video camera. Camera positions were determined to the millimeter, while actors' performances were fine-tuned to the centimeter. The length of the dialogue was specified down to 0.3 seconds. In every shot, the composition is overwhelmingly precise. This is not how commercial works are made, it is how art is created. In Shin Godzilla as well, Anno was thorough in his approach. He created CG for the conference room and determined camera positions to the millimeter. However, this technique was not invented by Anno. In 1987, with Wings of Hanyamai's, Toshio Okada and others took on the challenge. It was Japan's first previse. They had animators perform live, recorded it on video, and used that to decide the compositions. But Yoshiyuki Sadamoto and Mihiro Maeda said this. This approach is not acceptable. They believed that the compositions created in the minds of artists were what defined anime. Rather than copying Hayao Miyazaki's methods, they aimed to challenge the creation of entirely new anime. That was the conviction of Anno and his team. Hand-drawn, CG, live-action, miniatures, rotoscoping. The seamless fusion of all these techniques resulted in visuals unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Toshio Okada reveals the secrets behind Hideaki Anno's creative process.
Even if you throw that away, it's still incredibly impressive. So, let's talk about what makes it amazing, without any spoilers. I want to explain the techniques used in EVA. First of all, the way it's made is quite new in the history of animation, doing things that have never been done before. The opening footage is about 12 minutes long, right? It's available on Amazon Prime. And before going to the theater, you watch it on a monitor. Then, when you see it in the theater, the meaning completely changes. The screen size in a cinema makes a huge difference in how it's perceived. And anyone who has seen the trailer multiple times must have been surprised. In any case, the way it looks is different. What makes it different is that every shot has an overwhelming composition. The layouts are so well defined that there's no other option. The reason for this lies in the previse. Previse is where they first create a visualization before the storyboard, making previse before the storyboard itself. Previse, short for pre-visualization, involves building a simple model set and placing miniatures inside, and by moving them, they create a video storyboard. Using a video camera, they do it right on the spot, and they quickly insert dialogue for each shot. The first use of previse was in Star Wars, Episode 6. It was used in Return of the Jedi in 1983, and I've seen it in the making of footage, where Imperial soldiers ride speeder bikes through the forest, while Luke and others are trying to escape. They filmed that in the northern forests of Los Angeles. First of all, since it's in the forest, the lighting conditions and the time the sun shines are quite limited. And there are various conditions to clear, like environmental protection. So shooting was quite challenging. There were many constraints. Therefore, they created a simple miniature set and model. I tried filming in advance to see what kind of visuals we would have. We created the pre-visualization for the Death Star assault in Return of the Jedi, and it was a huge success. First of all, we were able to stick to the shooting schedule very well, which was important. This is from Shin Evangelion. I bought the pamphlet. It's quite an expensive pamphlet. Inside, there's an interview with director Tsurumaki. In the interview, director Tsurumaki emphasizes that the pre-visualization was successfully used this time. In animation, when you first create a storyboard, this storyboard supports the movement and layout, and in fact, animation is largely determined by the storyboard, as Tsurumaki says. In the anime industry, there has certainly been pre-visualization in the past, but it was typically created to improve the accuracy of the storyboard. In other words, once the storyboard is drawn, it would be made into a simple 3D CG, placing characters within it to find cool compositions and such. It was primarily used to maintain the quality after the storyboard. In animation, the interest is determined by the storyboard, and pre-visualization was used to get as close as possible to the appeal of that storyboard. However, in Shin Evangelion, pre-visualization was created immediately before the storyboard, that is. This was done to determine the perfect structure. This was also done in Shin Godzilla, where director Anno implemented it. In Shin Godzilla, during the pre-visualization phase, for example, in scenes where people move in a conference room, we created the conference room in CG, placed people within it, and decided on the camera positions perfectly, ensuring that it matched exactly on set. The camera positions were set down to the millimeter, the actors' performances were adjusted to the cent, and the length of the actors' lines was specified to within 0.3 seconds. It was that strict. Yidro no serihu na changsak shurto iu no wa. Konma 3 mao danwei diderding to iu kurayanthikira seta. In that context, Shin Evangelion is a work that achieved an overwhelming density of visuals. What this means is that it's not just a way to create commercial works. In fact, this is a way of creating art. It's a method of artistic creation. The ability to produce commercial anime with such high quality of contemporary art is thanks to this pre-vise. Additionally, in terms of technical aspects, we use hand-drawn animation, CG, live action, and miniature models. And there's also rotoscoping, which involves moving real people and incorporating that into the animation. This is used seamlessly. For example, there's a scene where a character is sitting in a traditional Japanese room while holding something heavy. In that scene, the layout is incredibly well defined, and the movements and shifts in weight are smooth. Without pre-vise, it would be impossible to establish such a precise layout, like where the walls are, and where the ceiling is, just from imagination. Next, to achieve those movements, the actors need to perform them. That's how the weight shifts happen. So, the synchronization between pre-vise, the actors' performances, and how that translates directly into animation is perfectly aligned. Also, while there are various movements, the characters' actions are performed by the actors, while the movements of objects they hold are exaggerated animated reactions. In other words, the objects they hold move with a slightly cartoonish flow, while the person moving them is just an ordinary human, creating visuals that could never be achieved in live action. This emphasis on different parts through animation is also remarkable. But more than that, the greatest advantage of pre-vise is that it allows you to completely determine the composition from the start. The beauty of animation lies in the detail and performance, and we often think of it as color design, but first and foremost, it's about composition. It's all about layout. To explain this, I'll use 36 Views of Mount Fuji. 36 Views of Mount Fuji is a series by Katsushika Hokusai created when he was 72, and this one is particularly famous. In this piece, you can see Mount Fuji in the background with waves crashing dramatically, known as the Great Wave off Kanagawa. And then there's this one. Another piece is this one. This is Bishu Fujimihara. For example, if you look at Bishu Fujimihara, I've thought about this a bit later on. The reason is, given Hideaki Anno's personality, he must have wanted to create a life-sized open set. He wanted to build a life-sized open set and decide on the composition while filming inside it. But reluctantly, he had to compromise. So, if he wanted to create a life-sized open set but couldn't, then he probably wanted to build the entire set in CG. And he likely wanted the actors to perform in that, but due to budget and scheduling constraints, he had to make a significant compromise. And I think he ended up using miniatures. So, in a way, it's a pretty good use of money. It's not that Hideaki Anno is indulging in wasteful spending. Rather, you could say he successfully managed to cut costs in this scene. Seeing this method reminded me that NHK documentaries often have a lot of inaccuracies. And this kind of approach isn't new. In 1987, there was an anime called Royal Space Force, The Wings of Hanyamais, which I participated in as a producer, and we used the same method. We had to create a very complex structure for the headquarters of the Space Force, so we ordered a pretty large model. A model that was about 1.5 meters in size. We used that to decide on the angles. Back then, there were no smartphones or flip phones, so, それで、アングルを決めたんですよ。当時スマホとかガラケーがなかったので、prepare the smallest camera possible, and have the staff shoot from various angles inside, discovering compositions like, we can capture this kind of shot, we can capture this kind of shot, and then apply that to the actual angles in reality. Also, I think the NHK staff didn't realize this. But it's actually a fascinating scene. This is the pre-VOICE shoot, right? At first, the actor is greeting. And you can see the full body suit with markers on it. This is a scene set inside a house back then. It's a family meal scene, with wooden framing around and strings laid out. What this is for is to indicate, there's a pillar here. There's a line for the sliding door here. It's all designed to make that clear. Well, there are pillars, a low table, and low angles. And the strings help to identify those, as well as the wood indicating where the pillars are standing. With this in place, it can be used as a marker, and they are filming inside. This method looks familiar to me because when we were making Royal Space Force, Director Yamaga mentioned that he didn't want the animator to just visualize layouts in their head. If an artist draws something like this composition in their mind, it ultimately becomes a good picture for the artist. But that's not what we want. We wanted to capture the composition properly, so we had the animators perform. So, actually, more than half of the cuts in Royal Space Force feature the animators themselves acting with a video camera. For example, there's a scene where they pull on Rikuni's arm, and when Rikuni, the girl, tries to go, they pull her hand. And there's a moment where her arm stretches out. Also, there's a scene where they open a door with a clatter. But for those kinds of scenes, it wasn't necessary to set up a full set. Instead, we prepared tables, chairs, and doors within GameX. So, we had the animators perform their actions. We recorded that on video, and then decided on the composition. The composition and timing of the performances, as well as the timing of the movements, were all determined through that process. Although I say all, we didn't manage to do it for every single cut. But we did it as much as we could. I think that was probably the first pre-visualization in Japan. The reason we did it was because I had seen Return of the Jedi and learned about the technique of pre-visualization. At that time, the term previs didn't even exist, but I knew about it. And Yamagata had heard about it too. So, when we were creating a new anime, we wanted to take an anti-Miyazaki approach. Both Yamagata and I, as well as Anno, love Miyazaki's works. However, if we followed Miyazaki's methods, everything would just turn into a copy of his style. Instead, we wanted to create something new in anime, which meant we had to try new methods as well. So, we built miniatures and had the animators perform. Because of that, many animators were quite resistant to it.